welcome back to my channel, and today we're going to be continuing Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. In the last bit, Mr. Dursley bumped into a tiny old man in a violet cloak. So let's get continuing. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He burrowed to his car and set off home, hoping he wasn't imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was a tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eye. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behaviour? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into the house. He was determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening's news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere had reported that the nation's owl have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at the night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight. There have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now over to Jim McCuffin with the weather. Going to be any more shower of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee had been phoning in to tell me that instead of the raining, I promised yesterday there had been a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks. But I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain, owls flying by daylight, mysterious people in cloaks all over the place, and a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. But Tuna, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, haven't you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked, angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff in the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls shooting stars, and there were lots of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, their son, He'd about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down in the front garden. There was a cat still there. It was staring down Privet Drive, as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think that he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mrs. Dursley lay awake and turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. Next page, we're still on chapter 1, by the way, and there's a picture of Dumbledore, as you can see there. I do realise him because he's got a very long beard and white hair. He's very old as well. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were lit bright and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realise that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he didn't seem to realise he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for in his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked. They put out until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks out in the distance, which were the eye of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back into his cloak and set off the down street towards number 4, where he sat down onto the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at Tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather serf-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings that the cat had around its eyes. She was too wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you had been sitting on the brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen feasts and the parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be more careful, but not even the Muggles have noticed something's gone wrong. It was on the news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in the Kent. I'll bet there was a Delos Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. We've had a precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably, "but that's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless out on the streets in the broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumours." She threw a sharp sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell us something, but he didn't. So she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles find out about us all." "I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We had to be thankful. Would you care for a sherbet lemon?" "A what?" "A sherbet lemon. They're kind of Muggle sweet I'd rather fond of." We'll continue this story in my next video. Hope you enjoy. Please subscribe, leave a like, and also comment down below what is your favourite thing about Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Bye guys!